Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the chattering teacup.
Hello.
And here with us from the wild, wild west, Alfred Stifsim. Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Greetings. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on our show. And we are here to talk about your debut novel, Wild Salvation, which came out in February 2022. And it is Western fiction. Like I said in the introduction, the Wild, Wild West. And I am quite certain that the teacup has quite a few questions for you. Teacup.
Yeah, that's because we're not very familiar usually with the Wild West apart from films made in the United States and maybe one or two comics. So I think sometimes it's portrayed as very kind of romantic and adventurous. And sometimes you have a lot of only hardships. I guess the truth is somewhere in between.
Yeah, I tried to kind of ride the line. I was a history major and decided I enjoyed making up stories more than telling existing ones. So I really appreciate kind of the historical side of things, but I also grew up watching a lot of old black and white Westerns and more modern Westerns kind of romanticize things as well. So I wanted to kind of, go right down the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And where does your fascination with this genre come from?
Oh, well, I grew up watching Westerns on the weekends. That here in the United States, on Saturdays, they would play a lot of cartoons in the mornings. But before that, you had to put up with the old black and white Western TV shows. And so I'd watch those with my dad while I was waiting for the cartoons to come on. So that's where it started.
Okay. And your book, Wild Salvation, it is set in 1876, 11 years after the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And your main character, Johnson, he's a black man. And he has to decide to go west, to escape, more or less, things that happened to him. We can say, tell us about your character, Johnson. Where did he come from?
So the initial idea came from the fact that I'm kind of a Western, lover, aficionado, and I just realized there's not a lot of Black characters in Westerns in general, let alone main characters. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of, friends who are Black and saw Westerns as something that wasn't necessarily for them. And so there are some other Westerns out there that have Black main characters, but I just kind of wanted to write something a little bit more, I don't want to say modern, but that kind of had some more undertones of modern issues, I guess. So there's a lot of metaphor in a lot of the book. And so I wanted to kind of do something that was fun, but also had some thought to it.
I mean, it is a very serious topic. I mean, the whole book starts with a short scene in a prison cell. And he gets free because there are no witnesses. We get a little bit of an idea what happened. And he has to flee, not really the law, but a law that was kind of taken in someone else's hands. You mentioned the Pinkerton agency.
Yes.
And where do they come in this whole, let's say, historic background? I mean, we've heard of them, Teacup, but we have no idea where they fit in this time.
Were they just some kind of private investigators
exactly.
Or something more with more authority?
Yeah, so the Pinkertons they're an interesting organization. They were started during the Civil War, kind of almost as an intelligence gathering agency for the North, and then became kind of almost anything from private investigators to like a private brute squad. They were used a lot to bust up a lot of unions and a lot of union strikes back in the day. So they were just kind of whatever you could pay for. It became kind of a lot of the rich robber barons, as they were called back in the day, used them any way they could for their purposes to gain what they wanted.
And how much authority did they really have? I mean, you mentioned in the book, of course, that the further you went west, the less there was a figure that represented the law. Mm. So was it also easier for them to, get in and represent the law and do whatever they liked?
Yes and no. Some of that's fictionalized because there was definitely, organized law at the time, and there was a lot of stories where, ideally what I guess in the romanticized view, we have this idea that people could go out and commit murder and they just get away with it. But there's actually a lot of, people would be brought to justice and a lot of court trials and things like that. But they were, because they had a lot of big money backing them, could get away with a lot more than, the average person could. But yeah, the West, the Wild West, as we like to call it, it was looser, but it wasn't. There were laws, but there was also less stringent, I guess, social codes and things like that. So there's a lot more people that understood, the law is thinner in terms of there isn't as much, so you could get away with more, which is also incidentally, why a lot of Black people went west, because it was kind of a new thing, and it was a little bit those same social codes between not just with the law and how people, decided to deal with things and put things in their own hands, but also in some areas it was a lot more equal. People didn't care as much about a lot of those racial codes as well.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it before, Teacup. I mean, we have a certain kind of picture in our head when we see the Wild West. Of course, it is because of the films and the TV shows we have seen in as well when we were children. And what about these different point of view? Because Johnson decides eventually he would like to go west and join the cattle trail. Sorry if I got the terminology wrong. And become a cowboy. In our point of view, cowboys, like the Marlboro Man, they are whites, they are weathered faces, and that's what they do. And how many? Because when he joins this group of people, he's not the only one. He's not the only Black person on this trail. There are quite a few others. How frequent was that Black people or Black cowboys were there?
How diverse was it in reality?
Yeah.
So in reality, the numbers come out somewhere between, the high end is almost half, but that's a little high. A quarter is a lot more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Being a cowboy was one of the highest paying jobs out west that you could have.
Okay.
It was also one of the most monotonous, so it had to be high paying.
Yeah.
But there was what they call range equality, where when they were out of towns, there was a lot more equality, a lot more freedom, because there were just a high percentage of Black people and Native Americans and Hispanics as well.
Yeah. You mentioned them as well. They also play a little bit of a role in your book, A Father and His Son, I think it was. Yeah. And it also begs the question, what about the women? Because Johnson meets a woman before he goes west, and she is what I would call your typical Eastern, higher up in society woman who decides, I want to go west, experience some adventures, and ride. And then we have the, let's say, complete opposite. We have Eddie, who hired him for the job of a cowboy, and they couldn't be more different.
It's more down to earth.
Yep, you can say that.
Yeah. So Margaret, who's the kind of, I guess, rich representation of a white female, it's kind of that idea of the wealthy, white woman who has this idea that she's, doing the right thing, that she is, coming out to document things, that she has this idea of being progressive, but doesn't realize that she's actually a little bit more backwards than she thinks she is. And a lot of that comes from her, just conservative background of just growing up wealthy and not really being exposed to the real world. And then Eddie is just kind of the foil to that, where she's, rough and tumble and just a fun character. Just that trying to, I don't know, give that idea that, it's not, there were several different types of women in the West. Margaret was kind of that, I guess, the more stereotypical type of woman that you'll see a lot of times in Westerns, where she almost, in a way, needs someone to save her. Although she ends up not, obviously in the book, but and then she does also. It's she's a complicated character, whereas Eddie is kind of the more self-made, rough, doesn't need anybody except herself kind of person.
And would you say that the average, let's say, frontier woman was more like Eddie? Definitely more like Eddie.
Yeah, I would say that not exactly like Eddie, but yeah, the average frontier woman had to be a lot more independent. They had to, be a lot more, willing to. I mean, people are adaptable.
Mm,
You put anybody in that kind of situation, they're going to learn how to shoot a gun, and they're going to learn how to, get used to being dirty and do what they have to do to survive. And I feel like that type of character, while Eddie's character specifically, there were women who were, on that level of, kind of rough and tumble. It was not as common as more just like the frontier wife who, lived on the range, or lived on a prairie or something, had the woman who, lived on a ranch and, took care of the animals and, did, farm work just as much as, a lot of the men did.
mm, mm. And what about the so-called buffalo soldiers? Because I more or less encountered them in the Bob Marley song. I have to admit that, to be honest.
But otherwise, no.
Not so much. But I did look them up when I heard the song, and they were black soldiers. When did this all start? What was their job? I mean, you mentioned a little bit of it in your book, but can you tell us a little bit more about them? Because one character in your book decides to join them, and he gets to know that it's a question of either you die or you survive. And it's a hard choice, or is it a choice really? I don't know.
So the Buffalo Soldiers are one of the most interesting, in my opinion, I think one of the most interesting groups of people in the Western history. So that kind of almost started during the Civil War as well, where they started bringing in black men and ex-slaves for all, black regiments during the Civil War because they were segregated. And once the Civil War ended, they were still, recruiting black men. And the major fights that the Army had to deal with after the Civil War were the Indian Wars, where they were going out west and putting down a lot of revolts of the natives. And there was just a large, I guess, group of soldiers who were, there's whole, I can't think of the whole companies of black soldiers. And the way that the story goes is that the natives thought that their hair, when they had their hair grown out, looked like buffaloes. And so the story is that they called them the Buffalo Soldiers.
Okay.
And that's where that came from. Now, I'm not entirely sure if that's just, again, one of those fun stories that you just hear, but it's been repeated so many times that it's kind of like that's just where it comes from.
Yeah.
But yeah, there were a lot of black men who joined the Army, and that was, again, another good way for them, to make money, and, they'd get pensions, and they were still segregated. Like in the book, I mentioned that they were still, even up until, I think it was World War II, the United States Army was segregated, and they still had white commanding officers.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of good people in your book. There are also dangerous people in your book. There are a lot of people in between. And we learn a little bit about those dangers we associate with the Wild Wild West, not just like you just mentioned. Okay, we have, for example, the Indians, the indigenous people who were seen as a danger. Those who didn't want to submit to the white man and go to the place they had made up for them. And we also have other people who are dangerous. In this case, at the beginning of his journey, when Johnson comes into contact with criminals.
Yeah.
And how common was that really? I mean, because every Western show or every Western movie has them. How common was that?
Again, that's one of those things where it's, a little bit more of the fantasy aspect. Okay. But it was a big, wide open area, and the law was thin. So, people were out there to make money for the most part. If they could make money, they would do it. And so that it definitely happened where there was a lot of crime and a lot of famous gangs of, that's kind of, it's based off a lot of the more, famous, I guess, Wild West gangs that are, led by some kind of charismatic character. But for the most part, I mean, that was less rare than maybe just someone, getting upset with somebody and, deciding they wanted to steal something or shoot them or, whatever.
I have some revenge.
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
Have some revenge.
Yeah.
And that's the thing too that comes up in the story is, a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of Western towns had heavy gun control, and you were not allowed to have firearms in the towns, and that happened quite a lot. You had to check in any guns you had with the sheriff or the marshal or whoever was in charge.
Because whiskey was flowing quite freely.
Yeah, that was another great American tradition is hard alcohol. So.
And card playing, I guess. It might get a bit emotional.
Yes, that also plays a major role in the book because there's a lot of cards playing going on in the middle of the book and at the end of the book. And also the ladies of the night play a major part.
Yeah, I kind of hit all the stereotypes.
Yeah, but I suppose it's not so much of a stereotype though, is it? I mean, come to think of the cowboys when they come to a town on their way west, and
it was their entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When
they spend hours and days sitting on a horse, and it's dusty and it's hot or cold or rainy, and they're not doing anything, and they get into town and they let loose, and there's any number of people there trying to steal all the money they're making.
Yeah.
Or whether through cards or through a brothel or they've got money to spend and they're gonna find a way to get it from them.
I somehow have this picture in my mind, comparing it to a cruise ship coming somewhere and all the tourists pouring out and spending their money.
Yeah. There's a lot of towns that were established based on that. It's almost the same way with resort towns where you've got people get off the boat. Same with Navy, in the Navy where there's those ports and they just get off and they've got nothing to do and then they've got all this money to spend. Very similar. A lot of the small towns in the Old West established along those cattle trails. That's why.
Mm. And how did it change, or how did that change when the train started to go west? Because it's also mentioned in the book that it changed a lot, especially for the people who worked at coach stations.
And the coaches.
I mean, the place where Johnson works during his first stop when he was going west, it's the question of, shall we give it up? Also, the towns on his way, are we going to give up our settlements because maybe the train takes another route west? How did the trains change the picture of the West?
That's another one of those. I mean, not to bring it all back to economics, but that's those things where it all comes down to money. A lot of the rich men who owned the trains and were kind of funding those, they did get, I guess, paid or influenced by certain people to hit certain towns and bypass other towns, and it did. It would turn those towns into ghost towns because there was, they got completely missed by the most important piece of transportation that the world had ever seen up to that point.
Can we say that the trains were the beginning of the end of the Wild West?
Yes and no. The trains definitely helped it. They're kind of pushed it. It helped the Wild West almost because that was one of the biggest, especially with the cattle drives, because the closer ultimately what the cowboys were doing were pushing the cattle from where they were, roaming free and grazing up to a train port or a train station where they could load the cattle and sell them off to, markets in bigger cities. And so, and in a way, it kept it going, but it did, like you said, it did kind of bring the mythical era of, the lawlessness to an end, because anywhere you got more trains, you definitely got more people, more civilization, so to speak.
And how long did the so-called Wild West last? When did it end?
Generally, what people consider somewhere in the 1920s, in a lot of the more, rural areas like Montana, Wyoming, and some people would say it's still there, because there still are, cowboys and there still are roaming bands of cattle. It's just different now. A lot of it's more fenced in than it was. There's a lot less, state, huge transportation of cattle like there once was. And I'm not the biggest expert on, modern day cattle industry, but there are several of people who still work on ranches and do pretty much the exact same thing. It's just a little bit more updated with, they still use horses, but they've got four-wheelers and other things like that too.
Now that you've spoken about a lot of things you've mentioned in your book, what does, in essence, define the American West or the Wild West for you? What has to be in a book that is Western fiction? What should be in there for you to make it a Western, a wild Western, so to speak?
I don't know. There's a lot of people who would say just as long as it's set in the West somewhere after the Civil War and between the 20s, that counts. Because there's all kinds of Westerns where there's like, dramas and mysteries set during that time period. It's really more, I guess, more about the feel. It doesn't have to have cowboys and, gunfights and things like that. There's plenty of other movies and books that are set during that time period. And it's really just more about the historical period that it's set in.
Jacob, you just said after the Civil War. We have been talking about that. Is it after the Civil War that we could speak about the American West? What was before that?
So there was a lot of the same thing going on before, but the romanticized time period of the Wild West tends to be the end of the Civil War to about the 1920s. But there was a lot going on, obviously, before that. I mean, pretty much leading up to the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, because there's obviously all kinds of hundreds of thousands of people here, which I know writers who write stories about, prehistoric, natives that live in the United States, and they're included in what you would consider Western writing. Same with a lot of people who write about, French traders and trappers and, Lewis and Clark, who is, I guess, not discovered, who surveyed the Louisiana Purchase after 1812. I think sometime around 1806. I can't remember, but off the top of my head, I can't. But, well before that, there's a lot of people who write about that stuff, both in history, historically, obviously, and also in fiction.
As you watched films, Westerns, since your childhood and you studied history, how much research did you have to do for the book?
Oh, I did a ton, especially on black cowboys. There's one of the best books I read is I think it's just called The Black West by William Loren Katz. And he's a historian who focused a lot on African Americans in the West in all aspects, not just cattle drives and cowboys and stuff like that, but just focused on, generally anything that a white person was doing, there was a black person doing it as well. And again, that kind of goes overlooked a lot in the modern media. There's, most up until recently, honestly, there haven't been many Westerns that have black people in them outside of, maybe like a side character here or there. And then I just kind of leaned on a lot of, my, background as an amateur historian, I guess. I don't know, because I got a degree in history and then didn't really use it to do much research in terms of, academic work. I worked for is our parks of a local parks department here where I'm from in Indiana for a while. But I tried to do as much justice as I could to the history here and there. Obviously, there's, again, a lot of fictionalized stuff, but that's why people read historical fiction and not history.
And what was the greatest challenge while writing this book?
Oh, that's hard. Probably just writing in general, since it was my first book. I'd not really written anything this long before. And so that was just learning how to navigate, finding a rhythm, finding a schedule. There'd be periods where you get writer's block and I wouldn't be able to get down more than just a few words here or there for weeks at a time sometimes. And then also the fact that, I'm not a professional writer. So, I've got a day job and, I've got a life outside of that. So it's you got to find a way to fit in the time for writing. So.
And would you say now, after writing this first novel of yours, are you a planner or a pantser?
Ooh, I like to say I'm like halfway in between. Cause I'll plan, I'll have like a skeleton of the idea in my head where there's certain plot points that I know that I want to hit, but in between there, it's just kind of, I almost joke that the characters kind of do what they want. It almost kind of writes itself.
And did you have a sort of, I don't know, on your wall, a sort of timeline? Because in your book, you how shall I put it? It's not a timeline that's
There are flashbacks.
quite.
Yeah.
Are they flashbacks? I'm not sure if we could call them really flashbacks.
It jumps from time to time.
Exactly. Yeah. How did you
Yeah,
not lose track?
Yeah, I had it kind of written down, and like I said, I had the bones of it written down, so I knew, okay, this is happening now. This character is doing this at this time, So it was complicated, especially again, like I remember thinking, like, this is my first book, and I'm writing this really complicated timeline. Why don't I go for something easier? And I was just like, well, it's coming out, it's working, so
Yeah, absolutely, it did. And you were pulling me along quite a lot, and then the revelation. We are not giving anything away, dear listeners. No spoilers, because you should read it for themselves. The revelation at the end of the book, or near the ending of the book, it was quite, oh dear, that was going on.
Unexpected.
Quite unexpected, to say the least. And I also wanted to ask you, did you ever think of writing your main character in the first person?
I did, but the big issue was I didn't feel comfortable being a white person writing from that perspective, writing a black character. So I felt like in terms of a lot of the anxieties of racism that they experienced, a lot of the black characters, even though I don't experience those things as well, I experience certain levels of anxiety, and I can, I guess, take those feelings and do my best to put those into, the feelings of those characters. But I didn't feel like it was my place to write that, from a first person perspective, not, being a person of color.
Coming back to that, I mean, you have a blog on your web page regarding the N-word.
Yes.
And the use in your book. Did you feel the need to explain yourself, or was there, I mean, you don't have to answer, of course, was there a certain incident which made you write this follow-up piece?
No, it's a difficult thing. It's obviously it's using it even in a historical context. There's some people who nobody's ever going to be completely happy. And that's, as a writer making that choice, you just have to understand that. But at the same time, I didn't see how I could write a Western that heavily dealt with racism and not use that word in certain instances. And like I said in the blog post, there was times where I did completely. There's times where I took it out completely and tried to make certain things work, and I just didn't. It just felt insincere, which to some people you might scoff at, but it didn't feel right. It felt almost like if I switched it with another, racial slur, it's almost kind of like, okay, we get what you're saying, like I don't, it just didn't feel right. As much as it didn't feel right to even write the word. But yeah, it was a difficult decision. I wanted people to, anybody who was curious to understand that it wasn't something that I took lightly necessarily, that I wasn't, trying to just throw it in there just to have it in there.
But it was used back then, so it's realistic to use it.
Yeah, exactly. It was. And there's arguments over how much it was, actually used. Some people say, because there's a lot of people, one of the common arguments I've heard recently is it's not used, it's not seen in a lot of writing correspondences as much, but at the same time, people don't write the way that they speak a lot of times. So it's a sticky subject, but I'm happy with the way that I left it. I felt like every time that it was used a specific purpose to kind of display, I guess, a feeling of those characters, or kind of specifically the one that in the blog post, which I guess people have to read now, but where it's talking about the very early on, the mother and the child, where, I wanted that to be understood, that kind of represent that idea that people can be racist and not realize that they're being racist. Like it, and that's a hard thing for a lot of Americans specifically to understand, because calling someone racist is immediately a trigger word, and it turns people off to any, I guess, level of intelligent correspondence as soon as you throw it out there. And so I kind of wanted to kind of just put that out there in a scenario where people can understand, oh, this is kind of similar to something I've seen in real life, I guess, which that scenario was similar. It's completely based off of scenarios that I've seen where I've met white people who will use the N-word and don't think of themselves as being racist, which is weird to me, but it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah. And the society in your book. When we, I don't know, put it together, we have the rich people on top of the pyramid, then we have the poor whites lower, then we have probably the black people, and at the bottom, maybe that's just my impression or my idea, I don't know. At the bottom even we have the Native Americans in society at this time.
Yes. Interestingly enough, and a lot of people don't know this, but so early on in American history, there wasn't a distinction between slaves being only black people. There were a lot of indentured servitude and a lot of, people who were not black that were in a similar situation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't necessarily what we'd call chattel slavery, but the idea of the black person being a slave that was ingrained into, I guess, specifically the American mindset was created as a way to give the poor whites something below them so that they weren't looking above them at the rich people who were also, even though they were, you had poor black people and poor white people who were, in the same situation. It was this idea that was created so that instead of them joining together and, maybe fighting back or trading something, more equitable, they were looking down at, the black people or the natives, and instead of looking up at the rich people who were basically taking advantage of them and leaving them all, poor and penniless.
Sounds a bit like a conspiracy by rich people to not have to share anything, not get any problems.
I think that's something that tends to crop up in every country.
Probably. In one way or another.
Yeah. Probably, yeah. And may I ask, where do you see the Western genre today? Where is it? Where should it go? Where can it go? Is it these days a thing again? Is it coming back? Was it ever gone?
So I would say, I'm going to give you the Western writer answer. It was never gone. It's always been there. It's always been very popular. It is definitely at its lowest point in popularity, I would say, because, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, movies and books were huge, and everybody, you could be a very, very successful, Western writer. You have people like Llewellyn Moore, specifically, who was like one of the most famous writers of the Western genre of all time. And people loved his books, and people still do. But back then it was more common across age groups. And now it's kind of more popular only among mostly older people. So some people see it as dying out a little bit, but this is where I like to think books like my book come in, and a lot of the movies that have come out lately where they do diversify a lot and show a lot of the perspectives that weren't as glamorized back in the day. So there's a lot of really good movies that show things from perspectives of, Native Americans, show things. Obviously, there's a lot of movies where they're almost entirely, black characters now. And I would say it's one of those things specifically in American iconography that it's always there. Right now, it's definitely that's like one of our biggest, I guess, socially and culturally, that's one of our most important histories, is that fantasy, that idea of, the West and the cowboy, despite where you live. Like, everybody kind of sees that as something that's kind of cool and something that's fun. And right now, I'd say there's definitely a resurgence, a lot of, especially in modern culture outside of just movies, a lot of musical artists right now are wearing a lot of cowboy hats and kind of Western style and making music videos that reflect that. And it's really cool to see. And I think there could potentially be a chance for there to be a new, I guess, I don't want to say explosion, but more new interest in Western fiction. And we'll just have to see if it does. I mean, it really just depends on, people want to read stuff that isn't what it has been. They want to read new stuff with those new perspectives that, include the people who are kind of left out.
Yeah. And do you think that the portrayal of the character and the society has become more realistic?
Yes, I do. But also, realistic is...
It's still fictional.
It's still fictional, yeah. I think I think what a lot of people want to see really is just they want to see themselves reflected in their stories. I remember one of the first things that made me think, oh yeah, I am glad that I'm writing this book is I was going to the library that's down the street from my house, and I was renting the movie Shane, which is an old 50s cowboy movie, and there's not a single, non-white person in it. And the lady who was working behind the counter was an older black woman. And she goes, oh, I love this movie. And I remember thinking like, oh, but there's nobody that looks like you or even, it wasn't even realistically made for you, but you still love it for what it is. And I was just kind of like, okay, I'm there is some of the purpose that I have in writing this book was validated, I guess, because it's like I want people to I love Westerns and I want all people to love Westerns too. And some people, for that to happen, they have to see themselves in it and realize that there is a history of non-white people, in Westerns. And realistically, I think it was back in the 30s or 40s, there was a huge Western, I guess it was not, I don't know if it's Hollywood or not, but there was a lot of Western movies that were made where it was like entirely black cast, all these old black and white movies. Well, I say entirely black. The main character was still a white guy that was passing as a black guy. But for the most part, they're highly, very popular movies amongst the black community back when, basically everything was segregated. And so there's, it's popular. It is popular.
And in your estimation, what would you say is the worst and what is the best Western? Be it a book or be it a movie or be it a TV show?
Ooh, that's really hard. I think the best Western that I've ever experienced would be Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, which is probably my favorite book. It's just, I don't know, it's hard to, it's just one of those books that just has it all. It's got the fictionalized stuff, it's got the kind of the more realistic stuff, I love characters, and it's got a lot of great characters. I always joke that when it comes to writing, I like emotionally manipulating my reader. I want them to, I want them to really care about the characters in a way that they don't even realize. And that book definitely does it. And then the worst Western, I don't even know, because I've seen some bad Westerns. Probably, there's a lot of stuff on Netflix that's just not good. It's just like the acting is really bad, and not even, sometimes I can get past bad acting if the story is good, but there's some stuff on there where the story doesn't even make sense or isn't even interesting. I can't get into stuff like that.
And now that you have written your first novel, what would be your advice for any other author, be it in the Western genre or any other genre?
Just got to stay persistent. Persistence is the biggest thing. You just gotta keep writing. Like I said, even in those periods where I would have writer's block, I would still try and, even if it was just 20 words, just try and get something down just to keep you going. Because that's really what it is all about, is just, I realized, I'd never written a novel before, and I was just like, okay, I'm just going to start this. And I realized, oh, you just do it. It's not like you're a novel writer. Novel writers write novels. No, anybody can write a book. It's just writing it. And that's the hard part, is writing something that's 90-some thousand words. And the only way you can do it is if you keep going.
Yeah. But you've written short stories before about the American West. Wasn't that?
Oh, yes.
Wasn't it also helpful in a way that it kept you focused?
Yes. And actually, interesting enough, sometimes it helped me focus and get ideas while I was in those periods of writer's block, because sometimes I would just have an interesting idea for something else, and I would, write a little short story, and something in it would trigger an idea for the novel, and then I could go back to the novel and keep going.
And what are your plans for the future? What can we readers expect from you in the near or further away future? Who knows? What are your plans?
So I'm in the editing phase of my second novel, which is not a sequel. I do have a sequel planned and a prequel. I actually have I have a whole book about Eddie that I have in my head that I'm really excited about.
Oh yes,
and
please.
I know a lot of people will be too.
Please bring it on.
Yeah, that character is one of the most fun characters I've ever written. But I'm in the middle of editing. I'm getting ready to do kind of an in-depth writing group with this book that I just finished, and it's kind of more of it's a Western, but it's almost more of less historical, more pulpy, I guess, more the fantasy side, but also incorporates some classic, I guess, crime noir things into it, which I like a lot of, crime novels and stuff too. And so I wanted to kind of incorporate the two, which I wouldn't be the first to do it, but I haven't seen it done in a minute. And so I'm excited about that. And then I've been writing a lot of other short stories. I actually just had a kind of a more modern Western short story published in an anthology, a print anthology for an online magazine called Cowboy Jamboree. And they don't do classic style Westerns, but they do a lot of more modern stuff and a lot of kind of, I guess, gritty contemporary stories. And I really enjoy a lot of the work that they put out. And I like, writing stuff for them as well.
So are you coming back to your crime Western subgenre? Will we see Sherlock Holmes riding through the prairie or?
Not quite. A little bit more like a hired gun who becomes almost someone solving crimes. I kind of got the idea from, perspective of the Pinkerton agent in Wild Salvation. It's just kind of like, well, we kind of show some stuff where he's got connections and some of the things that he does to find, Johnson and find the people that he's looking for. But I was kind of fascinated by the idea of like, what if you kind of focused in more on that character, except I'm not a big fan of Pinkertons because I'm actually a union electrician. And so there's kind of a negative history there with Pinkertons and any unionized person in general. And so I wanted to kind of write it from the perspective of almost like a hired gunman who, is trying to find somebody that he's, basically been contracted to kill. And it kind of focuses on him more and like the things that he does. And there's a lot, I don't know, there's some interesting parts where, when he's not working, like what does he do for fun? And, yeah, it's interesting. It's a fun kind of story. It's definitely not as epic, I would say, as Wild Salvation is, but I would say it is fun.
And just a quick question. How long did the Pinkerton agency exist?
I think it still exists today, actually.
Really?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think it's still one of the biggest private investigative services today. Okay. If I'm correct, I think they still do exist.
Okay.
I hope they stick a bit more to the law.
I think they do now.
Keep our fingers crossed in this regard. So, Alfred, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know? Anything else you would like to share?
Oh, not that I can think of. That was all the fun stuff, really.
And it was fun reading it, because I have to tell you, when you wrote about the cattle drive, you get a dry mouth when you read about what's going on, and you feel the need to cover yourself when there is rain for days and days. And I mean, it shows really well how hard it was, this life of the cowboys. I mean, like you said, Teacup, we sometimes get the romanticized version of this life, or more often than not, probably. But it was a very hard life. And I mean, it was not for everyone, was it?
No, yeah. That's part of the, anything where, you get paid more because you got to pay people to do it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't easy. And a lot of, like you said, the romanticized version, they don't show that as much. They just kind of show the glamorous cowboy sitting on a horse. But, they very rarely show the parts where you're, where your legs are sore and, you're getting rained on, like you said.
Yeah. And I found also quite interesting your depiction of life, or, let's call it that, life on these big steamboats, where we have the people, we would call them upstairs, downstairs, wouldn't we, if it were on land? I mean, you have the upstairs people, the rich ones, and this luxurious steamboat where people go on what we would nowadays say on a holiday. And we have the people downstairs who are not allowed upstairs, and they should never mingle or meet the people upstairs. It was a quite interesting point of view, and I've never thought about that, but reading it in your book was an interesting part. And also that they also had a lot of black people working on those ships.
below deck.
Yeah, below deck. No, also above deck. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I mean
present that.
yeah, like I said, anything that people could make money doing, they would do, and a lot of times that would be. I mean, even today, it's like people make money doing things that are essentially humiliating, but you get, you gotta live and you gotta eat.
yeah, yeah,
That
absolutely.
happens. Like I've been paid to empty trash, and people look at you like, oh, like, look at that person. It's just like I got paid to empty trash while having a college degree, and it's like people don't know, a lot of times the backgrounds of the people who do a lot of the dirty work,
Mm.
and
You
I definitely
absolutely.
want to pay that some
Yeah,
justice.
you're absolutely in the wrong country, I have to tell you, because in Vienna they are civil servants and they get paid very well for their job. And it's very hard
Probably should.
to get into this job.
Yep, that's true.
It's a little bit incestuous because
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
yeah, because you can only get in if your father, your grandfather, your
If you know
great-grandfather,
someone,
and
usually.
so on.
That's the way a lot of the union jobs here in construction were for a long time.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's the same everywhere, isn't it?
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah, people are people.
Yeah.
indeed, no matter where, no matter when. Dear listeners, read the book. It's absolutely fascinating. It was fascinating for me to learn about the Wild Wild West, besides the TV shows and the movies. Absolutely worth the read.
A different view.
A different view and a great story, a great book. You do not waste your time reading the book. Believe me.
That's good to hear.
Yep, absolutely. It was good. It was very well written. It was fascinating, and you kept pulling me along. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Will he make it? Will he make it? Read for yourself. And you already mentioned he will make an appearance again. Maybe a prequel.
He will.
Yeah, wonderful. Teacup, thank you for joining us. It was a great pleasure talking to you and
Thanks for having me.
learning from you about the Wild Wild West.
I love talking about it, so thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.